So it's been quite a busy few days for me, as you probably can guess, and I haven't done the right thing, and I've not spent a lot of time with Eric or Sarah discussing all of this in advance, which means, including Eric speaking on the stage today, he had vague clue what I was going to talk about. But I think that they are much more experienced and much more relevant in every way than I am in this space, because they're engineers and they work at the coalface and they lead teams working at the coalface. So if it's all right, Sarah, I'm going to start with Eric and this term curation.
Please do.
Tell us again about curation.
It'll help me get it nicely defined
Buy
as
you
well.
some time.
Yeah, that too.
So the short version of curation is it's the thing we need to fill the gap between the as-is open source that we produce in great quantities and make the world more innovative and more productive, and the top-down expectations set by a variety of players, mostly governments, reasonably on behalf of their citizens, saying we have expectations about security or safety and these are not negotiable. And you can't fill non-negotiable invariants with open source as-is software by itself. Right, those are in some sense incompatible without something in the middle. I call that thing in the middle curation, but the purpose of curation is to be an entity that is being accountable for those invariants and saying, yes, this software is going to meet your security requirements. And even though I'm getting as-in inputs from open source and leverage them, I, the curator, will do whatever's necessary to make sure that patches are applied, dependencies are checked, tests are run, the kinds of things that you would do if you were, doing high quality direct software yourself, right? So we want to leverage the open source. We don't want to say, oh, it's just got to be better, or just the maintainer should just fix it. That's not the model. The model is that you come to you as is. If you want expectations that are stronger than that on top, you need to bridge that gap. And curation is my mental model of how to do that. Exactly what that means yet is still being defined. I'm not saying there'll be a curator. I think there'll be many curators. I think there'll be curators of curators, specialists for different sectors, specialists for different countries. I've talked to 3 countries now that would like to have their own curation for the stuff for their governments on top of whatever other curation occurs in these spaces, because they have, that's how you really make sure that your particular government's invariants are met. So that's the role of curation. And I believe it is important to the long-term health of open source, and I think it's something that can be complementary to the roles that maintainers currently play, the creators of open source software, where they can focus on the parts that they actually want to do, and yet collectively we can still meet these higher order goals like security and safety. So I'll stop there, but that's the quick intro to what curation is and why we need it.
Thanks, Eric. So Sarah, do you have your own word for this, or do you want to work on Eric's definition of curation?
Curation is a fine word here. I think the interesting piece about curated software is one of the points that was made this morning by the audience, which is it risks moving the locus of responsibility from the person who is running the software to somewhere else in the value chain. And to your point, that has always been big companies with contracts to get support for things, and we see this across the industry now. I think it's a yes and. I think we need those support contracts, and we need to continue to talk about open source as a cost of goods and needing investment if you are using it. And if you are developing software, you are using open source. So I think there's a yes and there.
Yeah, and I think that's the interesting bit where Eric and I had a nuanced debate when we initially talked about this, because my model is very much this public-private enterprise, public-private partnership, where I believe that what the state will have to do, because they will have no choice, they will have to manage this. And it's not something they will have learned, I think, from proprietary software. I mean, they must have. Yeah. So I suspect that they won't just go back to that lock-in type model, and there will have to be an infrastructure created, but creating that infrastructure is a huge piece of work, right?
Well, there's an enormous piece of it that is quite literally just pulling back our skills, because we did all of that outsourcing for many years. So we have to be investing in those skills within our companies. And that's a risk, I think, still.
And I guess that's one of the beauties of open source, where that's skills development. And this is not a magic wand. You're not just going to suddenly start participating in an open source community and have the skills that you need. But there is the potential to learn the skills by becoming part of a community, by becoming a contributor. People are much kinder than I think we all expect when you make your first contribution. And there's a lot of support for people coming into communities. There are a lot of programs and projects, things like Google Summer of Code, that will help you learn and get you engaged with communities. And I suspect that a lot of the learning is done that way. Eric?
I do think it's an and, in the sense that curation does not by itself lead to a healthy open source ecosystem or a high rate of innovation. But conversely, funding open source, even if you gave it a $10 billion grant to fix all open source, that doesn't give you accountability either. Right, that just makes it healthier and more vibrant and faster innovation. So those two are both great, but they're complementary. Right? Curation is really about the accountability we need to use it in the places we're already using it.
Yeah.
Right? We are assuming it's trustworthy, and people are doing their best, but honestly, it's not there yet. It's true for software in general, but I think the curation is really about the accountability on top of as is software. But I'm 100% in favor of broad support for open source because it is an innovation engine, and it actually is also a collaboration engine, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point. I was about to jump in when you were talking about open source there, and it's true of all software, right? So in a digital economy, security is not an open source issue. We have our own nuances, and we wash our dirty linen in public when things go wrong. But security is an issue for all software and everything that's digital. And as a lawyer who spent 25 years negotiating contracts, many of which were proprietary, the reality is that your contract is only as good as the indemnity wording that you've got, the cap on liability, the exclusions to that liability, the insurance, if you were smart enough to ask for it, that sits behind it, and then you've got to go and look at what the exclusions in that are. You might not be named on it, you might be named on it, but there's all sorts of depth you have to go into. But in a proprietary environment, I would question whether you're actually getting very much more in most instances than you're getting from the open source. What you are getting, so it's not necessarily the liability piece, is you're getting someone you can pick up the phone to on a support contract.
You're getting accountability.
Yeah, to a level.
I think there's a to a level in that. You get support, you get someone to help you. I think the majority of the problem that we've seen, though, with Log4j specifically, was not even about delivering good, accountable packages, but the actual application, the successful integration into people's existing infrastructure. When we've had, turnover and nobody's touched that piece of code in 20 years or 10 years, and we've had nobody knows about that, and we don't have good ways to introspect across all of our code bases. Google has a very specific, very wonderful monorepo.
We do in most places, but even Google has places where we had to, go find Log4j by hand and pull it out, right? It's not perfect by any means. But I think that's a good example, sense of it was affected a huge number of things. Most people, had no idea they used Log4j. No one, myself included, would have put it on a list of critical software that needs to be protected, but clearly in retrospect it should have been. Right, but so we have tens of thousands of those things where we don't know yet that they're critical. Right? And but worst of all, to Sarah's point, you could fix it, like I said this morning, in a day roughly if you had a good process to actually find it, rebuild it, and deploy it. And most companies don't. And I would say no governments do. I can't name one that can actually turn around software and make an update. If they had a social security site, so to speak, or some other public information at risk, you actually need to be able to push security changes quickly. And in general, that's not possible today. I'm sorry, but it is technically feasible to do it. It is not implemented in practice. And that's a whole has nothing to do with open source. That has to do with software. Delivery in general.
And maturity of our industry. Because we still sort of YOLO our way into deployments, 12 times a day, which is not bad. I'm not saying that it's better when you wait 6 months and drop all of it in at once. I'm suggesting that there's less accountability sometimes.
It is also highly varied across sectors. There are sectors that are much more likely to do fast updates
Yep.
in sectors that are famously slow, maybe healthcare, for example,
Yep.
where there's,
Safety critical anything.
machines running Windows 98, right? No offense to Microsoft, but even they would say Windows 98 is not
Well,
recommended.
Not bad
it was also one of the challenges we would face in Canonical because, to be the lawyer that writes the contract, you have to understand the product and you have to understand the risk. And if you don't understand those, your contracts are terrible. So we would go to particular kinds of enterprises, particular sectors, and we would explain, well, in this contract negotiation, we're not going to take the risk on this particular thing because we'll push out bug fixes, we'll push out updates, you'll get one every day. And they would go, we're not going to implement a release every day. We're not going to deal with bug fixes every day. We'll do that every 6 months. And then you have this huge gap, if you do a gap analysis between the reality and what's possible to do. And then you get back into that proprietary mindset where we'll only take critical releases, and that's just not how open source works. And I think a lot of these software issues that we're talking about have shifted a bit. And I think the engineering practices have shifted a bit. So we're already working towards curation, or whatever you call it, and building good practice, right?
Yep. Even within open source projects, because we see more and more open source projects have deployment pipelines, build pipelines, so that test coverage, so that you can know that what pops out at the end has these constraints on it, or these guarantees of some sort, which of course still offer us no liability, but we know that these tests have passed. So in much larger, much more mature projects, you're almost at a curated state without someone to manage the support of it.
Yes.
Yep.
I think it's worth stepping back, though, about this velocity issue, because I think this is a software development issue, not an open source issue.
Thank you. Yes.
Absolutely.
Can't say that enough. But
Yeah.
I would say, I want to tie it back to the sectors a little bit, because why is that device running Windows 98 inside, and versus being updated to something new? And I think it's because there's a whole part of society in sectors that believe that the key to security is no change, right? If I lock it down and certify it, and now it's okay, then I'm done. And that's not true for software. In fact, it's the opposite, right? So if you want actual security and you're using software, and it's a network-connected device in particular, you have to be able to do updates, right? The biggest advantage something like Android or Chrome has is it's doing updates in the background for you all the time, right? Microsoft Windows is the same thing, to be fair to Microsoft. So that's part of having a good security posture. If your regulations say a device has to be recertified if you change the software, then that device software is never going to change. That's exactly what's happening, right? And healthcare is not the only industry to do that, but you want regulations to say the opposite. We expect you, if you're a network device, to be able to do over-the-air updates and make sure you're getting software updates and firmware changes, because the security posture is going to change every month. Right? That's a big shift we have to make as a population.
To sort of step it back from there even, you have two different speeds. You have the speed of the industry moving, and the cracks moving, or the hacks moving, and the risks in security vulnerabilities moving, and you have software moving. And so the two together really, the software that you're developing moving, and the two together are what start making, to your point, those gaps, because this may have been patched, but we haven't deployed it, but how is it, so it ends up being this lovely complexity. Oh, and I think I see a question.
Yeah, and it's a mindset shift, right? So I remember saying to people in Canonical that I felt like I was unlearning everything I'd ever been taught, because I was taught to be, a lawyer who protected the interests of the company, and to manage that risk and those interests, and to close things down and take the path of least resistance so that things wouldn't go wrong. But actually, if you want to innovate, you have to do the opposite, and getting all of us to be free. And I'll be honest, I revert to type at times. If the shit hits the proverbial, then I will be absolutely draconian about we just have to do this. But the reality is, if you want to be creative, you want to be innovative, and you want to see change, you can't be like that, and you have to open up. And I actually think there's a whole generational thing going on where we're seeing that happening more and more across a whole culture, but also in software engineering. So if you're okay with it, I'm going to suggest that we take questions, and I know Charlie's already got his hand up.
Sure.
Charlie's first, I think, and then gentleman at the back, lady here.
Do we have a mic?
Yeah. We should have 2 roaming mics in the room. I spec those as well. No? You can shout.
We can repeat it,
Have
yeah.
roaming mics.
We can totally repeat.
There we go. That's what we're after. It is our first session, so I did say there would need to be a level of forgiveness across the next day or two as we work things out.
Hi.
Hope you forgive us.
So I love the idea of curation, but in practical terms, a lot of the work on key open source infrastructure happens by individuals or SMEs with a particular specialism. What I'm going to ask is, how can the big tech companies, some of them represented in the room and some of the others, help these smaller organizations contribute? Because, to be honest, we need some of those large amounts of money that the big tech companies have to flow downstream to some of the smaller fry. But actually, working with big tech companies for small enterprises is very, very hard. It can take months and months and months of very difficult contracts and lots of money spent on legal advice to even get to the position where you can contribute to an open source project. So is there a way we can make this easier? Some kind of templates, some kind of procurement easement, whatever we can do, so the big companies can support the smaller companies who have that expertise?
I think there are 2 ways that this is happening already
Don't do that
today.
in the UK.
Oh, sorry. Apparently there are, which way? Okay, that way. 2 ways, or 2 ways, or that way. Okay, good. 2 ways, pardon me. There are 2 ways I think this is already happening. One, Google and Microsoft together founded the Open Source Security Foundation inside the Linux Foundation. And in that, we have a number of projects. To Eric's point earlier today, we're trying a lot of stuff. We're not sure what's going to stick completely. There's memory safety work. There's direct intervention with money to projects through a co-branded thing that we do called Alpha Omega. Mm-hmm. And there are a number of other different projects looking at, say, signing security to make attribution more useful and more capable and easier so it will hit more of our projects. So I think the second way that this is already happening is through these things like some amount of curation. Google has Assured OS. Microsoft has packages that we deliver for our company-led projects. And we also see that there's in fact a VC-backed firm that does this as well. Tidelift does this very well. It's an interesting model because they make the relationships with the upstream software, and you do buy functionally upstream maintainer insurance. So if you have a problem and you are if you are a customer of Tidelift, then they can help get that security vulnerability or issue fixed.
They're pretty interesting. I mean, the founders of Tidelift, Luis Villa, who many of you will know, a lawyer, coder, they are all ex-Red Hat, so it's unsurprising in the way that they've modeled it. It's very much along the sort of subscription model that you see from Red Hat. Eric, did you want to jump in on that?
I think there's a few things to add. I think the general approach here, you're right, Google can't actually meaningfully, individually interact with all the individual maintainers, right? We picked a few, like I mentioned, OpenSL, there's a few others in that category when they're really critical. So the path for Google, at least, is to work indirectly via mostly foundations. And so we've committed to $100 million spent over the next, it's 5 years, maybe it's 10, some number of years, to basically give that money through foundations to work on these problems. These are parts, OpenSSF is one of them, that's the biggest one so far, CNCF, which does a lot of work in Kubernetes space and all its dependencies. But, we're ended up founding things like PyPy for Python stuff. There's lots of, Microsoft's doing a similar thing with NPM because that's now part of GitHub. Yep. So I think this indirect model where there's an intermediary that's typically a foundation that can have us, frankly, a more direct, simpler relationship. And by the way, can work in many different countries, can deal with many different constraints that are hard for a big company, frankly. So it's one of many things we're trying, but I also feel like there are models coming where there are, ways for maintainers to do curation in addition to doing maintaining. And you've seen people offer private contracts to fix certain bugs. Yep. I'm talking with some developers about that model. And again, it's more of an experiment. We're trying to figure out how that works. Also, I'm trying to take an a la carte approach. Like if you're a maintainer, here's the things that I think we can do for you, but which ones are actually useful to you? Like oftentimes money's not even the biggest issue. Maybe it's you want credits for running test cases because you're using your own money to pay for all the testing. Or maybe you want someone to do some help on the security review. Or maybe you would just like a way to run pre-submit tests, what we call them, so that if someone makes a change, you can actually decide if that change is safe to accept without having to do a bunch of manual review yourself. So I think there's a lot of ways we could help maintainers, but it's, I think, an open question about, I've heard a wide variety of responses from maintainers, what kind of help they actually want. So that's why it's going to have to be some kind of a la carte approach.
I think there's also a way where we can sort of help ourselves, Charlie, and I don't know how well we've got this under control yet. One of the things that OpenUK did, and we're quite a different organisation, we don't follow the way that traditional industry organisations work. We're not a membership organisation. We're not made up of enterprises. We're made up of people. And we're made up of people who work in or want to work in open technology, which means that anybody, whether you're working for a UK company or not, can join us. And what generally happens is that these organisations are focused on homegrown companies because it's local companies they focus on, and therefore if you're working for a Google or a Microsoft, you can't really participate. So we're open to everybody that's interested in this space. But one of the things as a not-for-profit that we're able to do is join some of these organisations. So we're a member of OpenSSF, and we're a member of a number of different projects, and to my shame, we haven't done enough with it yet. But that kind of thing is where people who are in smaller companies who maybe can't afford to join these projects or contribute or get to be part of it can use us as a conduit to represent us on those projects. And I suspect it's something, I know there's a number of people in other countries who want to replicate our model from OpenUK because it's quite different and quite specific where we're helping them. And I suspect we'll see more sort of intermediary organisations like ours helping individuals access some of the resources that the big companies have, because as an individual it can be hard to do, but as a collective we have a lot more power and a lot more access to things.
Yep.
So I think there'll be more of that over time. So, question at the back there. Oh, he asked his question in round.
There are two of them.
Hi. Just wondering, just wanted to see your thoughts on whether we would have some open source software, maybe a ChatGPT further upstream to do some of these curations. So open source curation, and then further downstream, then you would have people doing the curation. What were your thoughts on that?
Oh, it's a great question. That's one I'm thinking about quite a bit, which is, and I'll broaden the question a little bit, which is a lot of the work, it's background, a lot of the work in maintaining open source is pretty mundane, right? It's not fun to do, and that's why it doesn't get done, right? It's just, the writing new features or getting something to work is a fantastic experience. Most developers love that part of it. I love it, right? But then, you know, patching some dependency that you didn't write and is broken because you need it to work for your case, not fun, right? So the question really is, what is the general role for ML to automate these tasks that are mundane? And I think there's a huge role for that. We see a little bit now with kind of pair programming or code completion, but that's frankly pretty primitive. Google has some internal tools that are pretty good, but they're not quite ready for prime time, but I think you can see that they're coming. But ignoring that, I think there's a very broad case here to be made for, oh, if you made this change to this package, the almost same code is over here in this package, it's probably broken too. So A, find it for me, because I don't want to have to figure that out as a separate CVE later. And B, why don't you just suggest a fix? Maybe I have to review the patch and apply it, but that's still a lot less work than tracking it down, finding all the versions, picking which versions are broken. Right? We can save a ton of uninteresting human work with this process, but I would say, stay tuned. There's a lot that's going to happen from all the players in this space in the next year because it is so exciting and it is needed.
There's one at the back there. Well, there's two at the back and this lady here.
Hi.
Have we got 20 minutes still? Yes. Yeah, okay. I hope you two aren't tired. That's quite a lot of work.
What do you
keep
see as the
gabbing.
cultural barriers to curation, and how do you overcome the cultural barrier of longevity? So something that was developed 2 or 3 years ago that's forgotten, as you've said, it's in the backlog. It's done, it's in production, but needs a patch. How do you overcome those?
Well, I'll give you a little answer first, which is the first point is just to point out that open source is way more inclusive and open and amenable to contributions across the board. So that already helps. And in fact, you know, open source was doing remote work well before COVID. So it's actually already naturally collaborative online. You can be in a wide variety of locations and time zones and be very productive. And that's a great freedom for many people that really matters. But I think your question sounds like it's more about you know, the kind of long tail of projects that have lost interest. And some of those people, the maintainers have said, I'm not interested in this project anymore. Like there's a famous story where the person gave it up because they weren't interested to a new maintainer. That maintainer, who in retrospect was anonymous, then corrupted it and used it as an attack vehicle, right? And you know, the original maintainer didn't mean for that to happen, but it happened, right? So I think important part for OpenSF that we're looking at is what are the packages that actually need to make sure they have an active maintainer on them? Because about 30% of packages don't have a maintainer at all if you just look at like activity, right? And there might be someone that thinks they're responsible, but you can't tell from the outside. And certainly you wouldn't know who to contact if there was a problem, right? So those are risky things to use, and maybe we shouldn't be using them, or maybe we should get someone to take responsibility. That's an option too. But we're still learning, I think, what is that long tail and how to deal with it. I would love to see, at least for the top 1,000 or 10,000 things, someone that views themselves as responsible. And they don't need to be perfect, and they don't have to have like all the things. But for Log4j, we had at least 2 people who say, oh, these people at least know the code. And we can't put it all on them, but they're a great place to start, right? And we can see what help they need, right? That's the approach you want to take. How can we help you in this crisis? In general, by the way, we're not very good at helping each other in these crises either.
Yep.
So that's a whole other area that I think that OpenSF would like to look into long-term, the kind of the firefighting crisis management aspect.
Yeah, I was going to
Go ahead.
Fantastic. No, one of the things that we have not yet manifested in the OpenSSF, but both Microsoft and Google have been talking about, is this firefighting force where we get multiple large companies who have skills to work together when someone goes, critical CVE in something that's going to hit, 200 million deployments. Like we need to pay attention to this today. But there's also still this challenge, especially with things that are long tail still used and maybe not maintained as well. How much of that is because you absolutely need that long tail thing, or how much of that is because you are not in the good habit of, updating your dependencies and moving forward? So there's another aspect of work that Microsoft is doing, which is in the IEEE, and we're working on open source standards, like what are best practices for my development community, which also include, supportable timelines. I'm giving examples. They will end up or not in the work, but 2 reviewers on every patch or every upstream. Like these are things that we're going to be discussed in the open to find out what the best practices are, to implement it, to then try to have this list that projects can look to, because a lot of the small projects, a lot of the really small ones that feel riskier, I think, to large companies, are accidentally famous. It's I had a left pad. I made a thing to fix my niche, and somebody else starts using it, over and over and over and over. And then I am getting mail, I'm getting GitHub issues going, why aren't you fixing this? Why didn't you do this? And I have no obligation as that maintainer. But we still need to figure out how to work with that in our own open source consumption. So I think this is going to forever be a question of the consumer and the provider, or the consumer and the curator in this space, as we evolve from this adolescent industry into a more mature industry that knows the risks and rewards of the work we're doing at more of a visceral level.
There's a lot around that, and I think one of the interesting pieces is to sit on a stage with Google and Microsoft, 2 very large companies, I'm sure you're friends, I'm sure you're frenemies, I'm sure you've got all sorts of different relationships, which all the lawyers in the room will be used to dealing with within organisations. It's life, it's how tech works.
Yeah.
And one of the...
used to work with them.
Right.
It's true.
There you go. So,
Yeah.
yeah. But what you see is this ability for, I can't remember what you called the fire response, the fact that you could have that response unit set up because it's innovative, it's collaborative, and it's open source. If it wasn't open source, you would not be collaborating in this way and sharing the outputs when something goes wrong. And whilst we do wash our dirty linen in public, there is that collective response and the many eyes being on a problem that allows the open source communities to respond in a different way and allows that response to be very honest and very open. And I mentioned Steve Wally before, totally different point. Well, Steve is running this IEEE project. I am very bad that I've not engaged very much because of this conference, but there's a lot of work going on in that. And I think it's something that I would commend to you, and we'll make sure we push it out in our newsletters at OpenUK for the next few weeks, so that those of you who want to get more engaged and understand the de facto standards that we're building as an industry for ourselves, get more awareness and engagement and access to that. I'm not going to get you up on stage, Steve, because you're probably talking about it tomorrow anyway, I think. And we had another question at the back. Christian.
Yeah, hi. So
He's back.
I was the guilty.
earlier.
I was
Can't
the
escape
guilty
him.
person from this morning that raised the comment about shifting responsibility. So I still kind of think, and this is a really interesting discussion. I still kind of think that the term curation or the discussion that's happening here, it's kind of, there's a lot of subjects coming into it, and I think in some ways that takes away from some of the narratives that we're trying to pursue as a industry. One of these is, I think, the question of software security, whether it's open source software or closed source software. I think that's the same question. You know, you have to secure your pipeline. There's a risk process involved, and there may be, and then I think there's a separate question, and this is what I kind of wanted to get down to, of how can you finance or contribute into that pipeline, which I think is a real question. And I've followed the work of Tidelift, for example. I know there are, I think GitHub has GitHub sponsors or some equivalent
There's loads
type
of these
program.
projects.
And I know when I worked previously in a large enterprise, we started to put in place service contracts with companies that would help us with software. And as a condition of the service contract, what we said was, you have to push your change that we have requested back to the community. And it's only when the community has accepted, or at least, you know, or rejected, but for a reason that we understand, will we kind of acknowledge that the work has been done and issue payment and all of this kind of stuff. So I think rather than talking about we need to change frameworks and all of this, I think the subject of security is valid. The subject of finance within open source communities is valid. But I think it's also a question of educating the companies that are using open source around how they can come back into that process.
Yeah, I think there's a massive piece of work to be done on the education side, and that's why we're hosting this conference, to be quite frank, is to get people at the table discussing these things, to make it something that's more engaged for all of us. We have, I think, 65 hours of content being produced from this conference that will all be freely available to download. And more of that needs to be done by more and more people. And we need to engage more with those who are just getting into open source or who've been using it and not even known they were using it. Yeah. But the thing that I would pick up on particularly is this open source versus proprietary. And I'm an open source advocate, I would say, these days. So that's a fair title, right? Isn't it? Yeah, okay, I'll take that now. So I think the thing is that whether you are being open source or whether you're being proprietary, you're going to face the same issues. The nuance of the issue is different. And you're facing issues of digitalization and you're facing issues of software, right? So the actual implementation, the actual instance of the issue might be different, but you've got the same fundamental issues. And I would actually challenge that we should be pushing the proprietary companies to also step up to the same game, because we have the same risk as consumers, from enterprises and from the public sector, of the black boxes they hold their code in going wrong. Hang on, Christian, you've had 2 shots and we've got other people down here, so I think that we should move on. But do you want to contribute something before we do?
I was going to suggest that proprietary and open source software really aren't any different anymore, and we need to be really careful about this. Well, hold on, because proprietary software includes open source.
Yeah,
end of story. At this point, 96% of software has open source components in it. When was the last time you wrote a math library?
So I didn't read out live every line because it was quite a lot from the DCM. I remember most of it, but there is a line in that DCMS wording that acknowledges that most proprietary software today will incorporate open source. Yeah, and I think that's a huge shift for a government department to actually get that is a huge shift. Eric, did you?
I'll just add, because maybe give some light on curation in general, which is even Google, which consumes a huge amount of open source, produces a huge amount of open source, it would be in Google's best interest to use curators for some things. And the reason for that is, if it's an area that you aren't going to actually put in the time to understand all the dependencies in a language you may not know, right, you should not be doing that work directly. Not to mention the fact it's probably not cost effective if you're using it as something that's not your core competency, right? So you need to do that indirectly no matter what. Right? And that's really the question, is how do we enable this indirect model where you can get software with support for a wide variety of open source packages in a wide variety of languages for a wide variety of use cases. Right? That's where we have to go. And even Google will be needing curated things, even though we're producing other things that are curated for others. They're complementary.
Yeah, and I think we need to move on to another question, but just before we do, I think there is a piece around copyleft. And someone like Frank Karlashek, who's down in the entrepreneurs room, would tell you that copyleft is a fantastic business model. And they would tell you that because it forces that contribution back. You can't redistribute without it. So it already exists as a concept. You know, we don't have to reinvent the concept. It's just how you want to manage your software and release it. Now, this lady's been waiting very patiently down here at the front.
Very patient.
Thanks. So I come from the data governance space and data management space. And it seems to me that there's so much we've learned in data governance that is directly applicable here, such as managing the metadata around the curation. And cataloging it and being able to analyze it, and then being able to also, so historically, one of the places that data governance started, of course, was with regulation around personal data. So to question to you, if you were to say to governments, there's something big enough for you to be interested in regulating here. Just like with data, it was personal data, personal information. What would it be? What would the one little nugget be to just get a toe in the door to making people think this is worth government level, maybe a lot other is worth IEEE level or standards level, and it probably should go the same way of data governance and be very broken down and everybody be governing things in small batches. But what's that one?
Yeah, boy, that's a tough one.
Yeah,
I
what's
have
the
a
lever
very
on?
esoteric answer, unfortunately, which I'll try to do quickly, which is that in general, there's 2 kinds of regulation governments do that are very different nature. The one we talk about normally is kind of top-down invariance. You must meet these properties. You can meet them however you like. If you meet them, you're good. Right? That's, lots of things fit that model. There's another model, though, that you don't think about as much, which is what we do in cryptography, which is, no, you don't get to meet a set of requirements. You actually have to use this implementation of this algorithm because we spend a lot of time making sure it works, right? And no other implementation is even allowed. So it's very prescriptive about how you solve it. And I think there's some reason to explore for the very low levels of software, things like how do you find a domain name, where we could be prescriptive and say, this is the stack to find domain names, it's open source, so it's not about competitive advantage, right? And we're mostly using the same code anyway today, so it's not a big change. But we can say for that stuff, it's so important, it's so fundamental, there's only one allowed way to do it. And it will change over time because the software changes, but that whole, we're prescribing the stack to use versus the invariants to meet. Now, that has not been tried, so that's a very speculative statement. But it would get us to a place where we have both velocity for those things and can make critical changes, and we actually can put in the effort to make sure it's right, which is hard to do if you just do a top-down thing and everybody's on their own as to how to meet that goal. That's good for high-level invariance, but I think there's a place to start at the bottom where we could say, let's grow something that's a really good foundation.
I think so Eric often goes to the technical, although you went to political this time, or policy.
This was mixed.
This was a mix, yeah. I often go to people, process, and community. And so I think what I would love to see as a tiny little tweak in regulation is even just language shift where we get away from commercial open source software, which doesn't, anyway. There's, in government regulation, there's also this concept of commercial open source software, which doesn't have anything to do with commercials, but yeah, anyway, it's complicated, and getting rid of that would be awesome. I think the other piece would be some sort of regulation or definition for a set of critical, maybe their projects, maybe their protocols, but some critical set of tech that then we are asked as our big companies to consider as cost of our goods. So that we then, as we consider it a cost of goods, we actually have to choose how we want to give back to this community, whether it's paying into a public goods fund or offering developers to the open source project or money to the foundations or whatever, but some sort of concept like that where companies that are consuming these pieces of open software are incentivized, whether it's a carrot or a stick, I don't know, but they're incentivized to be contributing back to make the software better and more safe, more secure, and more longitudinally useful.
I would do something that's not dissimilar, where I would create a regulation that required stewards to be created. And I'd make the stewards not just of open source software, I would also make them data trusts, so for open data as well. And I suspect you could have them, you can have an overarching, you can have them sector specific, there's lots of ways to cut this, but I think it's something we can't escape. And I totally agree about the digital public good. Yeah, you need a steward, you need somebody, it's not a foundation because it doesn't necessarily create the projects and the code, but it might be the space that hosts the code for government usage, for public sector usage.
A curator.
And creates it. Well, it's not a curator, it's a step further, because I see it as a steward, and this is where we slightly disagree, because I see it as very much a public-private enterprise, and it's something that has to be funded by the state. And I think there's a need for a sort of UN of those, which was partly why I was so pleased Salim agreed to speak this morning. We need that to be a global thing, and we need it to be something that's supranational and not just state by state. And that's a big ask, and it's a big thing to take on, but that's my dream thing. Away from actual regulation, the other thing that I would do is ensure that the public sector started to have more appropriate procedures to sit behind their policies. Because right now we have policies, but we don't have how you implement it. And I think we're going to take one last question and then wrap up. So Matt Jarvis has been very patient. Matt's on our board, sorry, that's why I know.
I'm going to be slightly controversial, I think, here, because if you look at the last 25 years, right, of free and open source software, there have actually been a ton of companies who've tried to do general purpose curation of open source. And I'm not talking about, your open core kind of model where they're supporting your own software, but in terms of a wide support of a wide range of smaller projects. And I would argue that there's probably only Red Hat who's ever actually made any money out of it, right? So what's changed from the economic perspective that's going to make that business model work now when it hasn't worked in the past?
Well, why it should work now, whether it will or not, that's an open question, is because it is now fundamental to society in a way that it wasn't even 3 years ago. that it is affecting every citizen and every government, maybe exception of North Korea or something, but basically everyone's affected by this. What role does the government have on behalf of its citizens to up-level this whole area? And conversely, even if we take the most basic U.S. regulation approaches, which is we're going to, through procurement, say what we're willing to buy, and it's going to meet these standards, that is already, you can see, starting to cause curation, even if people don't use that word, because that's the only way to meet those regulations. So this is inevitable, actually. I don't think we can discuss the form it takes, and we should,
exactly.
but this, if you have to choose between no security and no innovation, you're not going to choose either one, right? So this is the path that can give us both. I see it already happening in various ways, but what's changed really is the need and the demand and how much trust we're placing in open source today compared to how much we were 15, 25 years ago.
I think there's another component, which is when you look at Microsoft and Google, these are the best practices that have been developed for consuming open source. So, it's not evenly distributed in terms of the future being here, but for the most part, both of our companies ingest software, do some sort of review on it, go ahead and build it, then build our own internal feed anyway for these projects. So at some level, there is we are doing this, and it has become industry best practice. There's very few people who, go out and YOLO things off of, I guess not very few, there's still a lot of them.
There's tons.
There's still lots of them. Okay.
I mean, I guess playing devil's advocate.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's easy for Microsoft and Google to say that because that's not your main revenue stream to curate open source.
Yep. Yep.
So
It is a product,
No, but
potentially not, yeah.
Yeah, I think we're at a point in time where the scale of adoption, and I've read so many reports around open source in the last couple of years. During lockdown, it was pretty much all I did was read and talk about open source. And just the scale of adoption is the point that makes the difference. But frankly, as an open source community, if we can't go out now and make money, and if we can't shift things now, we're never going to do it, so we might as well go home. So this is the moment, this is the time, and if we don't shift open source forward and ensure that curation is there, we're going to end up with a flip back to proprietary, and this open collaborative innovation just won't have won. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. I failed to introduce my co-panelists very well. I just rushed everybody onto stage because I've done a lot of introducing today. And I should just thank Sarah Novotny, who is the Director of Open Source Strategy at Microsoft, and Eric Brewer, VP of Infrastructure and Google Fellow at Google. It's not often that anywhere in the world you get to sit on a stage or as an audience hear two people like this sitting talking together. And I'm deeply honoured on behalf of OpenUK that you've made the trip over to be with us. So thank you very much.
Thank you.